Hi friends, I welcome you all here at TNV Academy. In this session, we are going to talk about an international standard ISO IEC 17021-1. Now we shall discuss the clause 9 of ISO 17021-1 2015, that is process requirements. Let me start with the clause 9.1, pre-certification activities. The subclause 9.1.1 application specifies that the certification body must require an authorized representative of the applicant organization to provide the necessary information to enable it to establish the desired scope of the certification, relevant details of the applicant organization as required by the specific certification scheme, including its name and the addresses of its sites, its processes and operations, human and technical resources, functions, relationships, and any relevant legal obligations. Identification of outsourced processes used by the organization that will affect conformity to requirements. The standards or other requirements for which the applicant organization is seeking certification, and whether consultancy relating to the management system to be certified has been provided, and if so, by whom. Coming to the subclause 9.1.2, application review. The subclause 9.1.2.1 states that the certification body shall conduct a review of the application and supplementary information for certification to ensure that the information about the applicant organization and its management system is sufficient to develop an audit program. Any known difference in understanding between the certification body and the applicant organization is resolved. The certification body has the competence and ability to perform the certification activity. The scope of certification sought, the sites of the applicant organization's operations, time required to complete audits, and any other points influencing the certification activity are taken into account. For example, language, safety conditions, threats to impartiality, etc. Let us talk about subclause 9.1.2.2 now. The subclause 9.1.2.2 says that following the review of the application, the certification body must either accept or decline an application for certification. When the certification body declines an application for certification as a result of the review of the application, the reasons for declining an application are required to be documented and made clear to the client. Coming to subclause 9.1.2.3 now. The subclause 9.1.2.3 of ISO 17021-1 2015 states that based on this review, the certification body must determine the competencies it needs to include in its audit team and for the certification decision. Let us now understand the clause 9.1.3, audit program. The subclause 9.1.3.1 specifies that an audit program for the full certification cycle must be developed to clearly identify the audit activity or activities required to demonstrate that the management system of client fulfills the requirements for certification to the selected standards or other normative documents. The audit program for the certification cycle must cover the complete management system requirements. Coming to the subclause 9.1.3.2 now. The subclause 9.1.3.2 says that the audit program for the initial certification is required to include a two-stage initial audit, surveillance audits in the first and second years following the certification decision, and a recertification audit in the third year prior to expiration of the certification. This subclause says that the first 3 years certification cycle begins with the certification decision. Subsequent cycles begin with the recertification decision. The determination of the audit program and any subsequent adjustments is required to consider the size of the client, the scope and complexity of its management system, products and processes, as well as demonstrated level of management system effectiveness. It also requires considering the results of any previous audits. Subclause 9.1.3.2 also guides and states under Note 1 to refer to Annex E, which provides a flowchart of a typical audit and certification process. Further, under Note 2, this subclause guides and specifies that few additional items can be considered when developing or revising an audit program. They might also need to be addressed when determining the audit scope and developing the audit plan. Complaints received by the certification body about the client. Combined, integrated, or joint audit. Changes to the certification requirements. Changes to legal requirements. Changes to accreditation requirements. Organizational performance data, example, defect levels, key performance indicators data, and relevant interested parties concerned. The subclause states under Note 3 that if specified by the industry specific certification scheme, the certification cycle can be different from 3 years. Let us now talk about the subclause 9.1.3.3. According to this subclause, surveillance audits must be conducted at least once a calendar year, except in recertification years. The date of the first surveillance audit following initial certification must not be more than 12 months from the certification decision date. The subclause 9.1.3.3 further guides under a note and states that it can be necessary to adjust the frequency of surveillance audits to accommodate factors such as seasons or management systems certification of a limited duration, for example, temporary construction site. Coming now to subclause 9.1.3.4 of ISO 17021-1/2015. This subclause states that where the certification body is taking account of certification already granted to the client and to audits performed by another certification body, it is required to obtain and retain sufficient evidence such as reports and documentation on corrective actions to any non-conformity. The documentation must support the fulfilling of the requirements in this part of ISO IEC 17021. Subclause says that based on the information obtained, the certification body is required to justify and record any adjustments to the existing audit program and follow up the implementation of corrective actions concerning previous non-conformities. Now, the subclause 9.1.3.5. This subclause simply states that if the client is operating in shifts, the activities that take place during the shift working is required to be considered when developing the audit program and audit plans. Friends, now let me talk about the clause 9.1.4, that is determining audit time. The subclause 9.1.4.1 specifies that the certification body is required to have documented procedures for determining audit time. As per this subclause, for each client, the certification body is required to determine the time needed to plan and accomplish a complete and effective audit of the client's management system. Coming to subclause 9.1.4.2 now. This subclause states that while determining the audit time, the certification body is required to consider the aspects like the requirements of the relevant management system standard, complexity of the client and its management system, technological and regulatory context, any outsourcing of any activities included in the scope of the management system, the results of any prior audits, size and number of sites, their geographical locations, and multi site considerations, the risks associated with the products, processes, or activities of the organization, and whether audits are combined, joint, or integrated. This subclause 9.1.4.2 also guides under Note 1 and Note 2. The subclause says that time spent traveling to and from audited sites is not included in the calculation of the duration of the management system audit days. As per this subclause, the certification body can use the guidelines established in ISO IEC TS 17023 for determining the duration of management system audit when documenting these procedures, where specific criteria have been established for a specific certification scheme, example ISO TS 22003 or ISO IEC 27006. These must be applied. Now, the subclause 9.1.4.3, which simply says that the duration of the management system audit and its justification is required to be recorded. Let us talk about the subclause 9.1.4.4. According to this subclause 9.1.4.4, the time spent by any team member that is not assigned as an auditor, for example, technical experts, translators, interpreters, observers, and auditors in training, must not count in the above established duration of the management system audit. Subclause guides and says under a note that the use of translators and interpreters can necessitate additional time. Friends, let us discuss the subclause 9.1.5, multi-site sampling of the standard. This subclause 9.1.5 of ISO 17021-1 2015 specifies that the certification body is required to develop a sampling program to ensure proper audit of the management system, where multi-site sampling is used for the audit of a client's management system covering the same activity in various geographical locations. The rationale for the sampling plan must be documented for each client. This subclause says that sampling is not allowed for some specific certification schemes, and where specific criteria have been established for a specific certification scheme, for example, ISO TS 22003, these must be applied. Subclause 9.1.5 states under a note that where there are multiple sites not covering the same activity, sampling is not appropriate. Coming to subclause 9.1.6, multiple management systems standards. This subclause 9.1.6 states that when certification to multiple management system standards is being provided by the certification body, the planning for the audit is required to ensure adequate on-site auditing to provide confidence in the certification. Let us understand the clause 9.2, planning audits. Coming first to its subclause 9.2.1, that is, determining audit objectives, scope, and criteria. The subclause 9.2.1.1 states that the audit objectives are required to be determined by the certification body. The audit scope and criteria, including any changes, must be established by the certification body after discussion with the client. Coming to the subclause 9.2.1.2 now. As per this subclause 9.2.1.2, the audit objectives must describe what is to be accomplished by the audit and must include the determination of the conformity of the client's management system or parts of it with audit criteria and determination of the ability of the management system to ensure the client meets applicable statutory, regulatory, and contractual requirements. Here, under this subclause, the standard guides and states under a note that a management system certification audit is not a legal compliance audit. The audit objectives must include determination of the effectiveness of the management system to ensure the client can reasonably expect to achieving its specified objectives. And as applicable, it must also include identification of areas for potential improvement of the management system. Let me discuss the subclause 9.2.1.3 now. The subclause 9.2.1.3 specifies that the audit scope must describe the extent and boundaries of the audit. For example, sites, organizational units, activities, and processes to be audited. Subclause says that where the initial or recertification process consists of more than one audit, example, covering different sites, the scope of an individual audit may not cover the full certification scope, but the totality of audits must be consistent with the scope in the certification document. Coming to the subclause 9.2.1.4 of ISO 17021-1 2015. According to this subclause, the audit criteria is required to be used as a reference against which conformity is determined and must include the requirements of a defined normative document on management systems and the defined processes and documentation of the management system developed by the client. Let us understand the clause 9.2.2, audit team selection and assignments. Let me talk about the subclause 9.2.2.1 general. The subclause 9.2.2.1.1 states that the certification body must have a process for selecting and appointing the audit team, including the audit team leader and technical experts as necessary, taking into account the competence needed to achieve the objectives of the audit and requirements for impartiality. Subclause says that if there is only one auditor, the auditor must have the competence to perform the duties of an audit team leader applicable for that audit. The audit team is required to have the totality of the competencies identified by the certification body as set out in subclause 9.1.2.3 of the standard for the audit. Let me discuss the subclause 9.2.2.1.2. This subclause says that in deciding the size and composition of the audit team, consideration must be given to the audit objectives, scope, criteria, and estimated audit time. Whether the audit is a combined, joint, or integrated, the overall competence of the audit team needed to achieve the objectives of the audit. Certification requirements, including any applicable statutory, regulatory, or contractual requirements, and language and culture. This subclause also guides and states under a note that the team leader of a combined or integrated audit is expected to have in-depth knowledge of at least one of the standards and an awareness of the other standards used for that particular audit. Coming to the subclause 9.2.2.1.3. As per this subclause 9.2.2.1.3 of the standard, the necessary knowledge and skills of the audit team leader and auditors may be supplemented by technical experts, translators, and interpreters who are required to operate under the direction of an auditor. Where translators or interpreters are used, they must be selected such that they do not unduly influence the audit. Under this subclause, standard guides and stated under a note that the criteria for the selection of technical experts are determined on a case by case basis by the needs of the audit team and the scope of the audit. Let us understand the subclause 9.2.2.1.4. As per this subclause, auditors in training may participate in the audit, provided an auditor is appointed as an evaluator. The evaluator must be competent to take over the duties and have final responsibility for the activities and findings of the auditor in training. Coming now to the subclause 9.2.2.1.5 of ISO 17021-1 2015. This subclause of the standard specifies that the audit team leader, in consultation with the audit team, must assign responsibility for auditing specific processes, functions, sites, areas, or activities to each team member. Such assignments must take into account the need for competence, the effective and efficient use of the audit team, as well as different roles and responsibilities of auditors, auditors in training, and technical experts. As per this subclause, changes to the work assignments may be made as the audit progresses to ensure achievement of the audit objectives. Friends, let's talk about the subclause 9.2.2.2. Observers, technical experts, and guides. Let me discuss the subclause 9.2.2.2.1. Observers. According to this subclause, the presence and justification of observers during an audit activity is required to be agreed by the certification body and client prior to the conduct of the audit. The audit team must ensure that observers do not unduly influence or interfere in the audit process or outcome of the audit. The subclause also guides and states that observers can be members of the client's organization, consultants, witnessing accreditation, body personnel, regulators, or other justified persons. Now, the subclause 9.2.2.2.2, technical experts. This subclause of the standard states that the role of technical experts during an audit activity must be agreed to by the certification body and client prior to the conduct of the audit. A technical expert must not act as an auditor in the audit team. As per this subclause, the technical experts must be accompanied by an auditor. This subclause guides under a note and says that the technical experts can provide advice to the audit team for the preparation, planning, or audit. Coming to subclause 9.2.2.2.3, guides. Each auditor is required to be accompanied by a guide, unless otherwise agreed to by the audit team leader and the client. The guides are assigned to the audit team to facilitate the audit. The audit team must ensure that guides do not influence or interfere in the audit process or outcome of the audit. The subclause under Note 1 states that the responsibilities of a guide can include establishing contacts and timing for interviews, arranging visits to specific parts of the site or organization, ensuring that rules concerning site safety and security procedures are known and respected by the audit team members, witnessing the audit on behalf of the client, and providing clarification, or information as requested by an auditor. I sincerely thank you for your interest and attention. Thanks and best wishes.